Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Federnick, and I'm really excited about this particular episode because my two guests are on opposite ends of the political spectrum. They seemingly have opposing perspectives on an issue that's at the center of today's culture wars in education, the role schools should play with regard to students' gender and sexual identity. My first guest is Willie Carver. Mr. Carver is openly gay and was recently named Teacher of the Year for the state of Kentucky. In May of 2022, Mr. Carver testified before a congressional committee on civil rights. This is part of what he said at that hearing.
My name is Willie Carver. I am a 17-year teaching veteran. I sponsor multiple school groups and published in dozens of professional organizations. I'm a 2021 teacher who made a difference and was chosen among 42,000 teachers as the 2022 Kentucky Teacher of the Year. 40% of trans people attempt suicide, nearly all before they are 25, but one affirming adult reduces suicide attempts by half. We chip away at their dignity and spaces to exist. The systems meant to protect them won't even acknowledge them. I realize that for 15 years I have huddled around students, protecting them from the winds, and now the tornado's here. As the walls rip away, I feel I'm abandoning them, but I'm tired. I've fought for so long for kids to feel human, to be safe, to have hope. I don't know how much longer I can do it.
Well, just a few weeks after testifying, Mr. Carver announced that he had resigned as a high school teacher because he and some of his students had been harassed and threatened by a small group of parents, and because school administrators were unwilling to protect them. Mr. Carver now teaches at the University of Kentucky, where he continues to be an advocate for LGBTQ rights. My second guest is Dov Fischer, a popular orthodox rabbi who lives in Southern California, who's also an accomplished attorney. He wrote an editorial several months ago in the Orange County Register that really caught my attention. It was titled, "Now Only Parents Can Defend Parents' Rights in Our Public Schools." Fischer is concerned about the erosion of parental rights, and I'm quoting, certain deceptions perpetuated through public education. Elsewhere, he writes about government overreach. It's bad enough, he says, that some in government aspire to divide us by race, religion, or languages. But using our schools and law enforcement to divide our families? The issue he's particularly concerned about in this piece, the one that he says betrays parental trust, is a California policy that allows students to change their gender designation without parental consent. He concludes his editorial saying this: Sacramento, that's California's capital, of course, and the local school boards must leave parents to mentor their children on gender matters, end quote. Well, after reading this editorial, I read the comments that readers had posted in response. Most of them supported Fischer's position, but one reader took exception and called him a rather insolent name and wrote something to the effect that his dreadful opinion didn't warrant a rebuttal. But then I saw Rabbi Fischer's written reply to this reader. He ignored the insult and simply said he would have liked knowing why he disagreed. That made me think Rabbi Fischer might be willing to speak with people with different perspectives, like Mr. Carver, who did mentor students about their gender and sexual identity, and it was that mentoring that led to the parental harassment that ultimately caused Mr. Carver, Teacher of the Year in Kentucky, to quit his job. So why have a conversation with Rabbi Fischer and Mr. Carver? Well, I was really eager to see if two people with wildly different perspectives on this issue, and probably with opposing political views, would be willing to speak with one another on a recorded call. It turns out they were. But would the conversation be civil? Would they really listen to one another? Would they find anything they could agree on? Another reason for this conversation experiment is that I myself was curious to learn more about Rabbi Fischer's perspectives. especially his insistence that parents and parents alone should be the ones to mentor their children on gender matters. Would that extend to matters of sexual identity too? And what would he say about those parents who don't mentor their children well or at all? Is he just as concerned about the rights of children and their right to be safe, especially those who aren't mentored well, as he is with the rights of parents? You may be thinking now that as the host, I am revealing my biases, that I'm clearly in Carver's camp, not Fischer's, and would just be ganging up on Fischer if I jump in with my own questions. Well, it's true. I am biased. I have more questions and concerns about Fischer's opinions than I do with Carver's. But my hope is that if I pose my questions in a genuinely curious rather than confrontational way, he might welcome them. And I might end up learning something interesting about him or the problem we're wrestling with. One last thing before I introduce my guests. In this interview, I'm going to use a couple of depolarizing strategies that I've learned from interviews I've had recently with Amanda Ripley and Monica Guzman, two very thoughtful, award-winning journalists who have written extensively about how we can avoid getting sucked in and trapped by toxic conflict. Here's a short clip from my interview with Amanda talking about contact theory. What happens when people get to know one another just a bit on a personal level before jumping into a conversation where they might disagree? Here's Amanda talking about this way of initiating a challenging conversation.
Really, the only rigorously proven way to reduce demonization and prejudice is contact theory, which is by bringing people together with certain conditions, which are important, that creates a kind of transcendent identity that's bigger than the us and them. It sort of expands the us. And when you do this right, what you find is people are just much less likely to assume the worst of each other. So yes, to your point, you have like more resilience built into the culture so that when things go wrong, as they always do, right, in any complicated system, and especially schools, people give you the benefit of the doubt before assuming the worst because there's some human connection there.
Okay, so to tap into this idea of contact theory, to get my guests sharing just a tiny piece about themselves, I'm going to ask them right at the outset to describe what they enjoy doing when they're not working. I'll admit that's not a lot of personal information, and contact theory probably requires more than that, but let's just see if doing that affects the tone of a conversation that follows. Now, here is a clip from my conversation with Monica Guzman, the other journalist I spoke to, who was responding to a question I had about listening and how it can help depolarize a conversation.
Amanda Ripley, who you mentioned, wrote the book High Conflict, but she talks about that as looping, where you summarize what the person said and then check with them if you got it right. It's a wonderful gesture in a conversation because it demonstrates that you care about getting someone right.
Yeah.
A lot of times in conversations, that's not what we care about. We're not really listening. We're just trying to convince, or we're trying to win. So when you take the time to say, did I get this right? Let me make sure. Let me repeat back to you what you've just said. I talk about it in the book as the analogy being a base camp up a really tall mountain. You need to acclimate sometimes. You build base camps so you can stay the night and you have a moment to just check in and be like, we cool. You're hearing me? I'm hearing you. Okay, cool. Then you can climb higher. And that's what happens when we take the time to check in with each other. So when somebody goes, yeah, you got me just right. I mean, that person is now understood. That the gift of being understood is a pretty enormous one. And then people feel like they can open up with less risk.
Okay, we're just about to get started. And at some point, I'm going to ask my guests to loop back with each other to see if we truly understand what the other is saying. So let's meet our guests, Dov Fischer and Willie Carver. Dov, tell us a little bit about you, where you live, and what you do professionally. And then if you would add to that, tell us a little bit about what you'd like to do when you're not working.
I live in Irvine, California. and I'm a transplanted New Yorker. I also recently had a lung transplant, so I've had experience with transplanting. I'm a rabbi, and I have several careers, although because of the lung transplant, I'm in the process of weaning my way off one or two other of the careers. As a rabbi, I'm a rabbi of a synagogue Jewish congregation. For those not experienced with the term rabbi, I'm sort of like a Jewish equivalent of a pastor or a priest, only we marry. I also am a writer. I publish opinion pieces primarily in the American Spectator. I'm politically conservative, and in something called Arutz Sheva, or Israel National News. And so I write. Thirdly, I'm an attorney. Been a member of the State Bar since 1994. Was chief articles editor of Law Review at UCLA, and then clerked in the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. And after a few years of practicing law as a litigator, I came to feel that I'm very good at it and I hate it. So I became a professor of law. I had the information and knowledge base, and I didn't want to just dump it when I gave up litigating. And so that's what I do professionally. What do I do in my spare time? What are my other interests? I'm a huge baseball fan. And as a transplanted New Yorker, I'm a New York fan, both New York Yankees and New York Mets. My other interests are occasionally, I like to follow one television series until I've seen it through. I normally, not when it's active, but if there's a TV series in cable that really grabs me, I'll try to make an hour every night to watch it.
Dov, thanks so much for that. Willie, let's hear from you. I take it you're still in Kentucky, living in Kentucky?
Still living in Kentucky. Still in Mount Sterling, Kentucky, the small town. But I work in Lexington, Kentucky, the University of Kentucky. Like you know, I also have a million careers, I think. I work at the Undergraduate Resource Center, helping students navigate what the whole college experience is, which is an increasingly complicated experience. I also do a lot of writing, a lot of op-ed writing. I have a book coming out in June, which was a great experience this year that sort of jumped, I think, into my life because of sort of the experiences that have happened. And I'm trying to spin gold out of mud because what else are we going to do, right?
Do you have a title for the book yet, Willie?
Yeah, the book is written. It's called Gay Poems for Red States. And it's narrative poetry. I'm Appalachian, so I really I wanted to tell an Appalachian story. I sort of asked myself, not that Appalachians can't write the same poetry as anyone else, or that we should somehow be distinct, but I do feel like I come from a place where people speak in a distinct way. And I really wanted to ask, well, what if we had just invented poetry completely separate from everyone else? What would it look like? And I tried to run with that. I love words. That is what I do in my spare time. I do words. I speak French, speak some Spanish. My Spanish is terrible, but since I was small, listening to my grandmother speak, listening to my uncle speak, I wanted to know why people said things a certain way. I've always been interested in etymology. As a matter of fact, I took a class on the Old Testament, and we approached it from a midrashic standpoint. It actually reinvigorated the Bible for me, to sort of be told, you're worthy of responding to this text. You're worthy of writing and being creative in the approach. So yeah, that's kind of me.
By the way, where in Kentucky? Where in Kentucky are you?
I am in near Lexington, which is pretty central, but I was born and raised in eastern Kentucky in the Appalachian Mountain region.
The reason I ask is that I mentioned earlier in my background that I spent a year clerking in the United States Court of Appeals for a federal appellate judge. And that is the Honorable Danny J. Boggs, who's based in Louisville. And I emphasize Louisville, not Louisville. So I spent my year in Louisville, and during that year, I fell in love with Kentucky. I'm terribly sorry. We'll be talking about it as Ken leads us. I'm terribly sorry about what happened, what you encountered at the school. But what I actually found in my experience was that Kentucky, just a wonderful, wonderful place. I love every square inch of it, and I love the people of Kentucky. And, uh, and they're really just a lot nicer and a lot easier to live with than some of the New Yorkers and Californians, Angelinos. So again, nice to meet you. And you shared you taking the Bible class, which kind of like was a personal high five to me. And I wanted to share that I've got a Kentucky connection.
Lovely, thank you. And tonight, when I first met my husband, he finally said, "I'm starting to believe maybe you're some con artist because every time anyone asks where you're from, you give a different answer. But it all depends on how relatively aware they are. So had I known, I could have said I grew up about 5 minutes from Gene Wiley's gravesite near Paintsville. Uh, but I always give different answers. So near Lexington is true if you're coming at it from California.
Thanks for giving me and our listeners a sense about you and what you do and what you like to do when you're not working. So let's jump into this question, and I just want to remind both of you and our listeners that the point of this is to really try to understand one another and not really to try to convince one another of your particular point of view. And I also hope that we can search for common ground. There may be things I suspect we'll discover that you agree on, and it would be interesting to see if we can identify those things. So I'm going to ask each of you to take 4 or 5 minutes to talk about what you think the role of schools, public schools, should be with regard to students' gender and sexual identity. Dov, let's start with you. Take about 4 or 5 minutes, and then when you're done, I'm going to ask Willie if he can kind of summarize the key points of what you've said.
I believe that schools, primarily whether public or private non-sectarian schools, should focus on teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, mathematics, history, honest, true history, not 16 and 19 history. I believe that schools should emphasize teaching the American experience, so aspects of sociology and aspects of American culture. Allow kids to understand where their country comes from, how we got to be what we are, and to give children the tools so that they can independently think on their own and come to their own syntheses from all the information they've gained during their schooling, so they can do something really special with their minds as they go out in life, along with history and the social sciences, the hard sciences, chemistry, biology, physics, nowadays technology, so that kids ought to come out of school, I believe, with that kind of solid, well-rounded, general classic education. On the subject of teaching sexual identity or other areas like that, I respectfully feel, and this partly also comes from my being an Orthodox Jew, that these matters are more private. But as an Orthodox Jew, we are taught from a young age that sexuality is private and that one should live a life of tzniut. Tzniut meaning modesty, and modesty meaning you don't talk about sex.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question, Dov? I just you laid out what you think students should be learning, and you listed those subjects, and then you said that they shouldn't be talking about sex. But what about the traditional sex education courses for students where they learn about the very things that you're talking about that occur away from school among consenting people?
Ken, take a deep breath. Willie, take a deep breath, because you're about to meet a Neanderthal who believes that sex education does not belong in the schools. I went to school for 12 years. In my time, and it was a yeshiva parochial school, there was no sex education in that context, and yet I have 4 kids. Somehow I figured it out. For 2,000, 4,000, 5,000 years, people have been figuring it out. I come from a world where you don't talk about sex, you don't joke about sex. And so I just wanted to share that part of it so that you know where I'm coming from. It is not, God forbid, from a homophobic kind of particularly focused in that area. It's rather, I believe that schools should be a place for learning the classic subjects, and that matters of sexuality across the board tend to be things that I believe should be more private and such. And that's sort of my overview.
Okay, so here's my first chance at looping to see if Willie can summarize what Dov just said, and if he can, to see how it affects the conversation that follows. Thanks for that, Dov. Willie, before you give a shot at summarizing a few key points, is there a question you want to ask for clarification?
I think I actually feel pretty good. I think you were very thorough in explaining. I think effectively you believe we should have a classic education that focuses on those subjects like reading, math, science, emphasizing the American experience, that gives students literal tools that they can use to synthesize all the information themselves and then go do with those tools what they want to do, with a focus on, again, the entire experience being one that just lets them decide what they're going to do later. And there's also the modesty part of that. I feel like that's a different. And you also believe that not just homosexuality, but sexuality and gender, or sexuality is a subject that shouldn't be spoken about lightly, and that there's a modesty issue and a culture issue that comes to play, and it's best to avoid those topics in a place of learning.
Dov, did he get that right?
That's great, and he said it so much more to the point.
It's only because I have to meet 300 students in like a period of 2 weeks, so I'm used to trying to get the words out as quickly as possible while still being succinct, which is hard for me because I'm a Southerner and a storyteller.
Well, Willie's looping of Dov's views on the subject seemed to work quite well, and it sounded like Dov appreciated Willie getting it right. All right, Willie, now let's have you share your views on the same question, which is what the role of public schools should be when it comes to gender and sexual identity.
You know, what's funny is, I teach basic composition. There is a world in which I could take almost every word you said and say, I agree. But it comes down to definitions of what words mean. So, for example, I also very much believe that we should be focusing on teaching reading, writing, math, English, good, hard, solid sciences like chemistry, physics, the American experience, that we should be giving students tools for independent thinking. So we'll start with that sort of first half. When it seems really easy on the outside looking in to say, why can't you just teach reading? Well, I can say my experience would be to the, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but sometimes I have the naysayers who will say, just shut up and teach the basics. Well, if I'm teaching reading, right, whose story are we reading? Becomes an immediate question. So I have had in the past parents who quite literally say, we don't want you reading Black stories. We don't do that racial stuff. So they're asking because of their personal beliefs that I pull Black voices from the curriculum. And I've had parents who say, well, in this story, there's a gay character. We're not reading this story. So when we talk about the American experience, for me, the question becomes, who gets to be an American, right? Does the gay person get to be an American? Does a Jew, does a Muslim, does a white person, does a Black person get to be an American? Or do I only get to tell certain stories? Even when we're talking about, say, math class, or chemistry, we have to apply those concepts in some real world scenario. And the question becomes, do we apply those to all people? And that kind of gets to the second question about modesty. I think there's two conversations happening. One is sex ed in general. So I think that might, in some ways, be outside of the bigger conversation here about. So if we're saying no sex ed, I think that's great, and that if a person thinks that, that's fine. I think nearly every state allows parents to opt their students out of sex ed, if they so choose. And so there, I think that's good. If someone's religious beliefs prohibit them from saying the Pledge of Allegiance, or which has happened for some of my students, or for, in some cases, even learning certain topics, then they can choose not to have to take those classes. But if we're going to have sex ed, and you said something really nice, we've been figuring it out for 100 years, right? But I think there's multiple aspects to what sexuality is. And for LGBTQ people specifically, letting people let loose and figure it out can lead to issues, right? Can lead to the spread of disease. Even for non-LGBTQ students, there's making sure that people understand the basic functions of things, how pregnancy happens, how it doesn't. But again, I think that's sort of outside of this. I think one thing that I would focus on is when we say no sexuality at all. There is heterosexuality everywhere in our curriculum. When we read The Catcher in the Rye, there is a straight character who is having an interest in girls, right? When we read books in first grade, there's mommy and daddy. There's an inherent connection between men and women that exists in these stories. So the question, again, it's sort of similar to what I said before about whose experience do we emphasize. If we sexualize all LGBTQ people, we reduce the entirety of their identity, the entirety of their existence to something sexual. If I have a book about, I don't know, a kid who, I don't know, loses his lunch money and has to work to learn how work equals money or something like that. And that kid happens to have two dads, right? And a parent says, we don't want sexuality in our classroom. For me, what they're saying is, your existence is sexual. And then I kind of have an issue with that approach. So I always think of it in terms of whose experience gets to exist. But I would agree, so sexuality doesn't mean let's talk about how gay people engage in intercourse. That word can also mean Jimmy has two dads, or Katie has two moms, or this trans person exists. And I think that does that help sort of clarify the question or elevate the conversation in a way? Because I actually agree with everything you said. It's just when we say sexuality, what do we mean? That's kind of how I'm approaching this.
Willie, let me ask you a question that comes up for me, and it's coming up for a lot of educators these days and parents, and that is if you had a high school student that came into your class and said, my name is Michael, but I prefer a different name, Sally, and I prefer that you call me that and other students call me that. Is that something that you would honor? And should educators honor that?
My approach is, it's not my job to impose my beliefs on my students. The same, we give them the tools, they do with those tools what they want, right? So if a student comes in and he says, hey, it says Michael, but I go by Mikey, I go, great, Mikey, welcome to class. We're learning French verbs today. And if the student says, hey, it says Michael, but I go by Michelle, I say, great, Michelle, today we're learning French verbs, right? So it's not about me saying to all the students, hey, let's all know that anyone can change their gender at any time and you can be a new gender, and why don't you fill out this worksheet on what your gender is? Instead, it's about me being a human being and human beings coming into my room and me not imposing what I want them to be, me not telling them they should be something else, and me just letting them feel free to be who they are without government imposition. Because I take pretty sacredly the idea that as a teacher, I am an extension of the government in that moment. And so the things I say or don't say, the things I do and don't do, have a major impact on their civil liberties. And they don't check those liberties at the schoolhouse gate. They are free American citizens, and they're free human beings in my room.
Well, thanks, Willie. Dov, before you give a shot at trying to summarize what you heard Willie say. Are there any clarifying questions you want to ask him?
No, I think Willie is a tremendously effective spokesperson and representative of not only the mindset that he expressed, but in general. I think transcending the issue of mindset, I think Willie articulated his position in a very compassionate and sensitive way that someone who might disagree a bit still would have to come away feeling that I'm in the presence of a very considerate and thoughtful individual. I understand exactly where he's coming, or it's a bit arrogant to say I understand exactly where he's coming from, but I think I've got the idea, and that would allow me to do your looping as well. Because what I hear from Willie is that in many ways he and I agree, or you and I, to use the second person, you and I agree on the basic role of education, and classic education should be at the core of what students are learning. But Willie also raises, and I recognize this even before Willie said it, but of course he said it so well, the paradox that even if you try to avoid completely, if you try to avoid discussing sexuality and gender, the paradox that you can't avoid it because it's baked into the discussion that in the classic situation, a man and a woman are married. So whether you're talking about Catcher in the Rye as part of a literature curriculum in other books, which just matter-of-factly might be talking about husbands and wives, men and women, not even as the main storyline. Main storyline may be anything from how to make a salad to how to travel to the moon, but every passing reference to the husband and wife, the male husband and the female wife, actually reflects that even when you're not talking sex and you're not making sex jokes, it's baked into the curriculum that normal, and I'm using the word normal in quotation marks, that normal sexual relationships exist between men and women. And the absence of male-male or female-female relationships in classic literature for Willie's insight is that actually, whether by default or however you want to call it, is a commentary on what is normal and what is not normal.
Before Dov continues here, I just want to note that he also looped back what he heard from Willie and offered some compliments along the way. But now, after Willie and Dov have demonstrated some level of mutual understanding, something really fascinating is about to happen. Dov offers a poignant observation about something he and Willie might have in common.
So the question actually becomes, who is an American? Like, which cultures do we define out? Black voices and other voices. Who makes these decisions, and how do we define American? I even would share with you that all my life I felt, with the capital O, I have felt like an other, because even though no one's trying to preach Christianity to me, it's baked into the culture and into the literature that Christianity is normal, and by default, without even saying it, that being Jewish is not normal. So I get it. I get that paradox. And I don't want to jump ahead, Ken, because maybe it's later in your interview list of questions you want to ask, but I'm curious, Willie, why exactly, what was the problem at the school? What were they saying about your role that made your role at the school untenable?
Sure, thank you. And thank you also for that beautiful response and that extension of the concept. Uh, I I had a group called Open Light. It was an after-school club, and our effective purpose was positive systemic change. The student that club was created because a previous club, Happy Club, uh, didn't really try to change things. It just tried to inject happiness into the school. So these were kids dedicated to making the world a better place. It was an after school club, so it was optional club. They decided a couple years in to make themselves an LGBTQ affirming club. So it was written into the name, an LGBTQ affirming club, open light. So those students, they cleaned parks for free. They raised money for mental health awareness. They also taught themselves history, including LGBTQ history, including women's history, including Black history and Brown history that wasn't taught at the school. But they were an openly LGBTQ affirming group. So there were LGBTQ aspects to the work that they did. One parent started saying that this was a grooming group, that it was inappropriate that I, as a gay man, should be speaking at all on what she called sexual matters with the kids. She said it was indicative of predatory behavior. Then she started saying that we were a feeder group for a sex cult, sort of off the wall things. The school would not respond to her for fear that this was a political issue, and they didn't want to say anything. They also didn't protect the students who were terrified. This woman started taking pictures of my students at work and sharing them online, for example, and saying that my older students were grooming younger students. For me, what made it impossible to continue was seeing the school refuse even to speak to the students, even to say something nice about what they did as a group. And it was a system I didn't want to be a part of. I think before I was always a resistor, but I think anytime you see encroaching, growing evil in a group, especially when that is allowing bad things to happen, you have to ask yourself, what is my role here? And I think my role I couldn't continue to be a moral person and be a part of it.
So I'm not asking this next question judgmentally, but I just want to be sure. My inference, I'm understanding you were not fired, but for the reasons you just laid out, you felt as a matter of conscience you're gonna walk. I'll tell you how I differ, even as I respect deeply. Not only do I respect deeply, I actually am in the same boat. So with Ken's permission, may I take this another step? Ken,
Yes,
may I?
please.
I don't
No,
want to take away your show from you.
you're fine.
Okay. Two responsive thoughts, Willie. Personal. First one is going to be different from yours, and the second is going to be identical to yours. The way it would be different is if I were teaching public high school and formed a group that's going to be, let's say, discussing religions of the world. And then I've got some anti-Semite parent starts making complaints to the school principal. You know what he's really doing is he's taking Christian kids and he's subtly trying to sell them on Judaism, to abandon their faith and their practices, and he's trying to groom them, so to speak, to pursue Jewish conversion. And let's say it's a Christian community, and probably the same exact community where you were. And the principal came to me and said, here's what's going on, here's what we're running into. And where I disagree with you, I don't want to say disagree, where I would have done it differently, is in my case, I'd kind of throw up my hands and say, all right, to heck with my club. Go ahead, close down the club. This is wrong, you're wrong. I'm not doing any of the things you're claiming, but all right, to heck with it. And so I would not have quit over that. But I get what you encountered, and I get the challenge.
There's obviously a lot of history and more to this. For me, the major part of it was really about the safety of the students and the rights of the students. When there were other aspects, like those students not being allowed to use the same spaces as other students, not being allowed to use the same forums as other students, like they were wanting to do some serious research. They actually met with some researchers at the University of Kentucky, met with some groups who did climate research and really wanted to do climate research about their school. The school banned their, so I didn't want to be an extension of seeing someone else lose their civil rights, and knowing what might be coming, especially when I'm seeing what's happening in Florida. I think there was a part of me, and a part of a lot of LGBTQ teachers, who thinks, I had a friend actually just come to me the other day and say, there is no way I can do this. If they pass a law that says, for example, that I have to ignore a student's request and use the gender that's on their birth certificate, he said, I don't think I can do it. Or if I get some law that says I am not allowed to say the word gay in class, for example. So I think there's a lot of things. And this also happened about 2 weeks after another LGBTQ teacher received a good 30 death threats for telling his students that they were safe with him in rainbow letters. So it was a lot of things, but I see that there are similarities in these stories. And thank you for sharing yours.
So this is where I decided to pose my own question about something that Dov had written in his editorial. Let me jump in with a question about what you raised, Willie, in student safety. Dov, you and your editorial concluded with a statement to the effect that the mentoring of students with regard to gender identity should be left to parents. It's not the business of schools. Does that capture what you said or what you think?
That's a fair summary of a lot of what I think, yeah.
Okay, so what I would like to know is what happens if you have particular parents who are not good mentors. In fact, they're really bad mentors and they don't provide a safe place for their children at home. And rather than mentoring, they punish them. I'll share a story. I was speaking with my daughter, who's an educator, about the interview I was going to do with both of you. And she told me recently that one of her high school students is homeless. And the reason that student is homeless is because she went home and had the courage to share with her parents that she was queer. That's how she identified. And her parents told her she could no longer live with them. So that wasn't, I don't think anyone would call that mentoring. And they rejected her and she was out on the street. And so my daughter and some of her colleagues have since then tried to create a very accepting, safe place for her. And she continues to get that support. And I've heard many stories, including some from Willie, about people who said, were it not for what Willie did, or another teacher who accepted me and provided a safe place, I'm not sure I would even still be alive. I didn't play this clip for Dov during the interview, but I'll play it now because it contains comments from a student I interviewed several months ago. That interview included guests who also thought schools and teachers should leave matters of sexual and gender identity to parents. The student you're about to hear is Nora Lauder, who recently graduated from high school. Coincidentally, Nora, like Willie Carver, is also from Kentucky.
In my experience, I am not out to my parents. I'm out to some of my teachers. When I have conversations with my teachers, I feel safer than when I have conversations with my parents. I think that a lot of these conversations talk about parents being the primary safe space for students when they are not. And this is coming from a student. This is not coming from a concerned parent or a concerned citizen. This is coming from a student. Parents are not always the safe space. They're not. They're simply not the safe space all the time. I know so many queer kids who can't go home and be themselves. Do you know how hard that is when you can't go home and be safe around your parents? I think that if we started listening to queer students more often, listening to their voices, we would actually hear about the relationships that they have with their parents. And maybe parents aren't always the stakeholders that know everything that they know about their own kids.
On one level, if parents, in the general perspective that I shared in my article, the typical parents should be capable of handling the subject within the family construct, and do not want, and I don't want, my children, if they're in public school, having the public school teacher fill my role if I'm adequately capable with my wife to fulfill that role. But there are parents who cannot fulfill that role because they're intolerant, they're tyrannical, they're not smart. And no matter what you try to default to them as parents to do, they're just not going to get the job done on any level of being compassionate, listening, and counseling and mentoring. And so the idea that such a child from such a home would then go to his or her teacher in school, Willie Carver, and say, Mr. Carver, can I meet with you outside of class after class? There's something personal I'd like to talk to you about. A setup in which Willie has not, and I'm not buying into the idea that you groomed anybody, so don't get me the wrong way. We're talking about a situation where Willie is a teacher who does not groom students and he's just a teacher, but we know he's gay. And the student wants to talk to Willie out of class, and it's not part of a large group or a student club. And Willie sits down, he doesn't know what the student wants to talk about. It could be sports, it could be whatever. And the conversation becomes that the student has certain sexual issues and orientations or curiosities. And I actually have no problem with Willie sitting compassionately and providing the counsel outside the classroom setting that the parents are not providing. I have no issue with that. And if I'm the principal of the school and somehow that comes back to me, I'd want to talk to Willie. I've got parents complaining. And Willie would explain, well, here's what happened. Student X actually had been trying to talk to her or his parents. And the kid was like 2 steps, if not from suicide, from some kind of meltdown, asked me for some time out of class. I really would have no issue with that. I think, frankly, I've been in that situation in 2 different ways. And therefore, I'm relating again personally. I hope you don't mind. I know a lot of this is about Willie, and it's turning out to be a little bit about me also. Because again, I'm an other. So I'm teaching, and I have a student comes to me, and basically is 3 weeks behind in the reading. And when you fall behind in reading 3 weeks in law school, kiss it goodbye. That's it for the term. You'll never catch up. And I could see this had been a very good student, and she's just not been good the last 3 weeks. I think I was the one who initiated, let's meet after class. I want to find out what's going on here. She explained to me that she had come out as a lesbian to her parents during Thanksgiving or something, whatever it was. And the response was to throw her out of the house. And she has nowhere to live. She's homeless. For the last 3 weeks, she's been in law school living in her car. And I'm sitting and listening to this. And you already know from this conversation and everything else where I stand on gay versus straight. But I'm listening to this and my heart melts. And I spoke to my wife and got my wife's approval that, number one, if you need to live in our home until we get this thing straightened out, we'll make our home available. If you need a few bucks to pay rent somewhere, I don't know what to tell you, but anything I can do to help you out. If you want me to call your parents, but as I said, if you want to be in my home, whatever it is, and if it violates some kind of law school rule about a professor having a student, I'll talk to the dean and get the dean's permission or whatever, but I need your permission as a student to even talk to the dean about it. I've had 2 or 3 or 4 in my 16 years, 2 or 3 or 4 situations on that variety. Likewise, 1 or 2 situations where people wanted to talk religion with me. Religion, because I wear a yarmulke and I'm an Orthodox Jew, every so often a student would get the idea if I talk to him about Judaism, I'll get a higher grade. So I'm going to ask him 1 or 2 questions about Judaism and see if I could thereby suck up to him. And so I made it a policy early on. I don't talk religion. I don't talk religion with any. To me, the idea is, look, I'm wearing the yarmulke. That already tells you who I am, where I'm coming from, and if I live a good, honest, ethical life, and I'm a good guy, that's my way of promoting Judaism in this law school. Simply being an Orthodox Jew who behaves himself like a mensch, like a good person, and that people can go home and say, I've had 12 professors, and 8 of them are a-holes, and 3 of them are neutral, and Fischer is a nice guy. He's the one decent guy I had in law school. So that's my way of promoting Judaism. And I'm sure many students came away from Willie Carver over the years with a sense of, this guy represents the best of what the school had to offer. And I honor him, and it probably even changes some people's attitudes from homophobic to a respect for people who might be different from the accepted norm, because they meet a really quality person who's different from what stereotypes they might have had. So again, that's like where I land on that. But yeah, for safety, if the parents aren't doing the job, then I'm totally supportive of the idea that if a student privately approaches a teacher to talk after class, and the teacher perceives there's a safety, a health issue, for the teacher to be involved in intervening.
Well, that was a bit of a revelation. Going into this interview, I had made an assumption based on what I had read in Rabbi Fischer's editorial that he was insensitive or naive or simply playing up to like-minded conservative readers by promoting the now popular idea among many in that group that government is, and I'm now quoting from Fischer's editorial, separating parents from their own children in order to indoctrinate children with radical gender ideas. But what he just said in the interview makes me think that Rabbi Fischer is neither insensitive or naive. Not only would he support a teacher like Willie mentoring a student about a sexual or a gender identity issue, but he himself did the same with several of his own students, and even offered to take one into his home because her sexual identity caused her to become homeless. Rabbi Fischer sounds like a compassionate person to me, someone who is concerned not just about parents' rights, but also those of students. But I still do hang on to my suspicion that he might have been playing to his conservative readers by not acknowledging that some parents don't parent well, that some parents are, in his words, intolerant, tyrannical, and not smart. By omitting that, by promoting a false binary and speaking in very broad strokes, his editorial, like so much of the discourse in today's social media, needlessly broadens the divides among us. As a compassionate person, I wonder, why would he want to do that? Okay, let's go back to the interview with Rabbi Fischer and Mr. Carver. I'm going to ask a question about something else that Mr. Carver had been involved with at his high school, something that directly led to his decision to quit. Dov, what about Willie's club, LGBTQ club, that he spoke about that provided support for students who wanted to study and talk about matters related to that, what the club was about?
For me, if the principal or the head of school is telling me, we're getting complaints about your Jewish culture club, we need you to close it down, I would close it down. I would feel bad, and I would feel that you're taking away something very valuable. But I recognize the politics of the moment, and I'm just gonna, I'll just look. I won't quit the job. I'll just let the club go down. That's the difference. That's the difference for me.
Willie, share your thoughts on all this.
I think for me, and I can understand how someone would have a different perspective. It's about the world I want to give students, and I know from experience, so the last 5 years I taught, every single year I had a student somehow leave me a note that they were going to commit suicide. They were all queer students. Mostly, there are apps that teachers use where they can send homework information and kids can respond. Mostly, it would come through those means. So I know the danger. And I know the statistics too. 64% of LGBTQ students seriously considered killing themselves in the last 12 months. I also know when we talk about specifically unsupportive parents, luckily most parents are supportive, but a good 40% of LGBTQ students live in homes where they say they're not supported.
Hi, my name is Jackson Campbell. I live in New York City. I attend Union Theological Seminary, and I was a student of Mr. Carver's between 2015 and 2018. Well, when I came in 2015 into the high school, I had been discerning a lot about my identity and my sexuality and just how to express myself, which a lot of people do coming out of middle school. But Mr. Carver's classroom was kind of a, I don't like to use the word safe space. I think it was more of like a brave space to be bold and to be who you are. When I came to high school, I lived in a more conservative home, and sexuality conversations about that was just not acceptable at the time, and that went the same for school and for church. If I said anything to anybody about who I was, it was going to become an issue. And so one place I could do that was his room. It was not, it wasn't a concern to him, and it wasn't going to be something that he was going to go tell other people. His room was just a place where you could come and be yourself.
Conversion therapy is still a serious issue in some parts of the country, and Kentucky is one of those parts. The statistics on that are terrifying. Some researchers looked at adults under the age of 25. Regardless of the time that had passed since conversion therapy, there's a 20% chance that a person who's undergone it will commit suicide that year. So not think about it, but will commit it. So every year that number does not go down. So, over 5 years, that number is astronomically high. These are the things I'm thinking about when someone says, you have to look at these students and say, you don't get the same rights as other students. If my school wanted to say, we're going to shut down all clubs, then I would say fair. If my school wanted to say, we're not reading anything so that you don't read anything gay, then I would say fair. But I just don't think personally I can look at these students and say, you have to accept a reality in which you're less than. Because I've lived the experience of being less than. And somewhere deep in my soul, I can't do it. I can't be privy to it. I can't, and I've done it. I have done it to them as well. When those students came to me the first time, this was 6 years ago probably, their group had not called itself LGBTQ inclusive, and they said, can we call ourselves an LGBTQ inclusive group? And I talked them down. I said, well, maybe we can say an inclusive group, and we can list all kinds of peoples, and LGBTQ can be a part of that. And they came to me a couple of years later and said, it feels like you're ashamed of it. It feels like you're ashamed of us. And I realized, even if I'm trying to play some political game, even if I'm trying to placate the authorities, what I'm doing is transferring shame onto students. And if I am acting as an extension of the government with a sacred and precious role, who am I to extend the shame, right? Who am I to cause harm to a citizen or to a human simply because people want it, right? That's kind of my approach to all of it.
I respect it. I'm not going to come back and say you're wrong. I respect where you're coming from. A little bit of it also is I come from a culture and a mindset, and you have not adopted this mindset, and I cannot say that you're wrong. I come from a mindset that I will never, ever have an even playing field for where I'm coming from in America. No country in 2,000 years of Jewish exile from the time the Romans exiled us from the land of Israel in 135 of the Common Era, no country ever has allowed Jews to be full Jews and have equality, including America. The deal with America is the more you're willing to give up the core of your Judaic uniqueness, the more equality you get. But if you do not buy into Christmas and have a Christmas tree and go visiting neighborhoods that have beautiful Christmas lights, you never will have equal footing in this country. So, Willie, where I think I come at it a little bit differently, and who's to say you're wrong? Certainly not I. You want full equality. You actually believe, and who's to say that's wrong? You actually believe that it should be just full equal terms. I come from a place that I don't believe I'll ever have equal terms. So I am more at peace with the idea of a principal telling me, Dov, we understand you've got this religion club here at the public high school, and we've had some complaints that you're talking about Judaism, and we want to close down the club. I'm more at peace with the idea of, all right, let's close down the club. And I'll continue teaching excellently, and I will have students occasionally, that one or two students every year, who come to me after class and say, Mr. Fischer, Rabbi Fischer, Professor Fischer, I desperately need to talk to you one-on-one after class about a subject. Do you have some time? And that's the way I handle it. I just would not quit the job over that, because I come perhaps from a different mindset to begin with.
I had a similar conversation with a friend who is one of the most intelligent, fiercely fighting teachers I've ever known, who's also Native American, who lives on the West Coast. And we were in education moment. It's later here, but someone was there was a group of people sort of forgiving someone for being willing to silence a young student who had gay parents, so that student wouldn't talk for the sake of the other students in the room whose parents might be against gay marriage, for example. And I was furious at the whole concept. And these were also all friends of mine, but the whole idea that we're going to sacrifice one child for the sake of everyone else really, really got under my skin. And this teacher who I was talking to said, something to the effect of, my people still exist. My people are still here. And the reason that we are still here is that we've learned that we will never get to some dramatic place where we're fully free. We understand this. We understand that we are resisting primarily. And that resistance might grow some space for some other people to continue the work. And I remember in that moment having this thought, I don't want anyone to have to do this damn work again. Like, I want to explode with the life I've been given and then burn a path so that no one else has to walk it. And I do think these are cultural issues, right? I think I come from Appalachians who fought the government trying to force them to work in coal mines. So like there's a long history of letting yourself live in abject poverty before you will acclimate to someone else's goals. Whether we're talking accent, obviously my capacity to get a job as a teacher, to make it through university, whether it was conscious or not, involved my accent changing, right? So I understand the rules of the game and how terrible the game are. And I don't even begrudge someone who engages in those things, right? I don't begrudge any Appalachian who shifts their accent so that they can have a fair shot at money who can feed their kids, right? I can't begrudge someone of that. So I understand that there is the same with me leaving. I don't think there was a right or wrong answer to me quitting, because the moment a gay teacher became the teacher of the year, I was no longer me. I was a symbol. And probably 100 queer teachers have reached out to me, mostly from Kentucky. And I knew I can be this sort of shining symbol that gives them hope while also undergoing horrific homophobia, or I can gravitate towards the truth. And the truth would be letting people know what was happening and telling the story of that school. That dashes hopes, but also clarifies what's real. So I'll offer that just to say I know what it's like for there not to be a right answer. I know what it's like for us to just do the best we can with the circumstances we've been given.
Well, on that note, let me just ask both of you as we're winding down here to just say a few words about today's conversation and what you take away from it, what you learned, and whether you think this approach of having people that had seemingly different perspectives on this issue have come together and listened to one another and been compassionate and understanding and reflective about what's been said. But I would love to hear from both of you just a little bit about today's conversation. Dov, you want to share your thoughts?
I don't want to say this the wrong way, but on a certain level, I haven't really changed in my views on the subject of the last hour and a half, both in terms of what I published, but I did not write a second article because nobody asked me to, or there was no burning desire on my part to write it. But I could have written another article about the gay people I've met and known, and the relationships that I've enjoyed, and the respect and mutual respect I've had with such individuals. So that didn't change. It's not like there was some kind of an Aufklärung, a sudden enlightenment now, where for the first time I've met someone who's gay, and all my stereotypes have been washed aside. So I would say today's conversation, it didn't so much change me as help me make a new friend. I enjoy very much getting to meet Willie. I continue to feel that there are things that should not be taught in the classroom or discussed in the classroom. I continue to endorse the idea that if a student comes to Willie and says, I need to talk to you out of class about a subject that's very burning inside me, I'm all in favor of Willie meeting it, da, 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 da. And so I don't want to reiterate things I've said earlier, but I've enjoyed the conversation very much. And it's helped me clarify for myself certain of my own thoughts.
Willie, your thoughts about today?
One, I will reiterate, it's been absolutely a pleasure making a friend and getting to talk to you, Dov. I very much hope for a speedy recovery with your lungs, and have enjoyed just getting to know you as a human being. I'm walking away from this thinking a lot about definition, and how effectively what I hear you saying is I want a world where we focus on reading, writing, arithmetic, hard science, and every American has a voice. And if a parent doesn't want their kid to learn sex ed, then they shouldn't have to. I agree with everything you're saying. You're saying that if a student is in trouble and they need to go to a teacher for help, then that should be allowed. I'm saying I agree. I think oftentimes, and this is sort of the nature of prejudice in general, but we come to conversations carrying an image of what we think we mean and what we think someone else means. And my guess would be here's what everyone I've ever known who's had my experience as a teacher responds the same way to students that I do, right? My guess would be that if each of us spent the time talking more, we would see it's less about shifting what we think, and it's more about realizing how small the distance is between what we think and what someone else thinks. Because I know it appears that there are tons of people in comments. I had an editorial or an op-ed published yesterday in the Louisville Courier-Journal. Probably 100 people saying, why are you making this about sex? We shouldn't be talking about sex. And I'm thinking, I think I agree, but I don't think this has anything to do with what you think it has to do. I'm sure there are perhaps conservatives saying, we don't need to be talking about sex in school. And probably most liberals would also agree, like, yes, we shouldn't have overtly obscene materials and the things that I think most of us would disagree on. So anyway, I'm using a lot of words to say I don't think that the issue in America, probably for a lot of issues, is about changing each other's minds. It's about realizing each other's minds, maybe.
With that, Dov, I want to thank you for being part of this conversation.
Thank you very much.
And Willie, the same. Thanks once again for being part of this podcast and for sharing your thoughts and listening to what Dov had to say and just being, I guess my heart goes out to you, especially because you're such a great teacher. And I have great admiration for teachers, having been an educator all my life. And I wish that I could have been a student of yours, and I guess in some ways I am now. Well, now that I've had a chance to reflect on this conversation, there's still a bunch of unanswered questions in my mind and some pretty important conflicts that still need to be addressed when it comes to the school's role vis-a-vis students' gender and sexual identity. How do we protect teachers like Mr. Carver, student members of the LGBTQ affirming Open Light Club at his school who were harassed by homophobic parents? How do we change the pernicious narrative about gay teachers grooming their students, or about governments working to separate students from their families? It's fully legitimate, of course, to call attention to parents' rights, as Rabbi Fischer did in his editorial. But what about the rights of LGBTQ teachers and students? Who will defend their rights? But I'm also feeling inspired about the power of civil, respectful exchanges like this one. Exchanges where people seek to understand one another rather than to win arguments, where people can disagree and have rich, important disputes without vilifying or dehumanizing each other. I was struck by Rabbi Fischer's empathy and admiration for Mr. Carver as a person, as a gay man, and as a teacher. I was struck by his realization that both of them, one because he was Jewish and the other because he is gay, had suffered the effects of being the other, of not being seen as fully American. And I love what Mr. Carver said near the end. If we spent more time talking, we'd realize how small the distance is between what we think and what someone else thinks. That's not always the case among people who disagreed, but it seemed to be so here. And I loved what Rabbi Fischer and Mr. Carver each called one another at the end, a friend.